In the summer of 1824, a 15-year-old enslaved boy named Isaiah created weapons from stolen materials in a hidden workshop beneath a tobacco barn in rural Virginia, trained over 200 enslaved people in their use, and led the largest successful mass escape in Virginia history, moving his entire group 300 miles north to Pennsylvania without losing a single person and without firing a single shot, despite being pursued by armed patrols and professional slave catchers for 3 weeks. Isaiah's achievement was so extraordinary that Virginia authorities suppressed all official records of the escape to prevent it from inspiring similar attempts, and for nearly a century, the story survived only in oral histories passed down through the families of the people Isaiah freed, and through cryptic references in Quaker records from Pennsylvania. The full truth about how a teenage boy accomplished what experienced resistance leaders had failed to do, how he built an arsenal without detection, and how he moved 200 people to freedom through territory where enslaved people were constantly monitored and where any black person without proper papers faced immediate arrest, would not be fully documented until the 1920s, when historians finally pieced together the fragments of evidence that Isaiah and his fellow freedom seekers had left behind. Before we descend into the story of the most brilliant teenage freedom fighter in American history, hit that subscribe button right now, smash the notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below. This is Epoch of Fear, where we recover the stories of resistance that authorities tried to erase from history. Isaiah was born enslaved in 1809 on Riverside Plantation in Hanover County, Virginia, about 20 miles north of Richmond. His mother, Ruth, worked as a house servant, and his father, whose name was never recorded in plantation documents, was a skilled blacksmith who worked both at Riverside and was hired out to neighboring plantations, a common practice that allowed enslaved people with valuable skills to generate income for their owners, while occasionally earning small amounts for themselves. Isaiah grew up watching his father work at the forge, learning metalworking techniques from childhood in the way that enslaved children often learned their parents' trades. By age 12, Isaiah was already skilled enough to assist his father with complex metalwork, and by 14, he was producing work of a quality that impressed even the white overseers who supervised the plantation's operations. Isaiah's owner, a man named William Harrison, recognized the boy's value and began planning to use him as a blacksmith full-time once he turned 16, seeing Isaiah as an investment that would generate substantial income through his skilled labor. What Harrison did not recognize was that Isaiah was also extraordinarily intelligent in ways that went far beyond his metalworking abilities, that he could read and write despite laws prohibiting enslaved people from being educated, that he had been carefully observing the plantation's operations and the surrounding area's geography for years, and that he had been planning an escape attempt that would be unlike anything Virginia had seen before. The catalyst for Isaiah's plan came in early 1824 when his mother, Ruth, was sold to a plantation in South Carolina. The sale was motivated by Ruth having angered the plantation owner's wife through some minor infraction that was never clearly documented, and it demonstrated the absolute power that slaveholders wielded over enslaved families and the casual cruelty with which they exercised that power. Isaiah, at 14 years old, watched his mother being taken away in chains, knowing he would likely never see her again, knowing that nothing he could do would prevent this separation. The experience crystallized something in Isaiah that had been developing for years. The recognition that slavery was not just unjust, but was fundamentally evil, and that the only response to such evil was complete rejection and active resistance. Within days of his mother's sale, Isaiah began planning what would become the largest and most successful mass escape in Virginia history. He did not plan to flee alone or with just his family, as most escape attempts involved. He planned to free everyone, to organize an escape so large and so well executed that it would demonstrate to enslaved people throughout the South that freedom was possible if they were willing to fight for it, and if they were smart enough to outthink their oppressors. Isaiah's plan was built on several key insights that demonstrated his remarkable strategic thinking. First, he recognized that most escape attempts failed because they were improvised rather than carefully prepared, because people fled without adequate supplies or knowledge of the route, and because they moved alone or in small groups that were vulnerable to slave patrols. Isaiah decided that his escape would involve months of preparation, extensive resource gathering, training in self-defense and group movement, in coordination with free black people and sympathetic whites in Pennsylvania, who could provide assistance once the group reached the north. Second, Isaiah understood that enslaved people were constantly monitored and that any unusual behavior would attract attention. So his preparations had to happen invisibly within the normal operations of plantation life. He could not hold meetings that would be noticed or stockpile supplies in ways that would be discovered. Everything had to be hidden in plain sight or concealed in locations where no one would think to look. Third, Isaiah recognized that while violent resistance might seem like the most direct path to freedom, it was actually the least likely to succeed because any armed conflict would bring overwhelming force against the escapees and would likely result in many deaths. Instead, Isaiah planned to arm his group well enough to deter pursuit, but to move so quickly and efficiently that armed confrontation would never be necessary. Finally, Isaiah understood that the escape's success would require absolute trust and discipline among the participants, which meant he needed to recruit carefully and to train people in working together before attempting the actual escape. The construction of Isaiah's hidden weapons workshop was perhaps the most audacious aspect of his plan and demonstrated his combination of technical skill and strategic thinking. Riverside Plantation, like most Virginia plantations, had a complex of barns and outbuildings used for storing tobacco and for various aspects of agricultural operations. One of these buildings was an old tobacco barn that had been partially abandoned as the plantation's tobacco operations declined in favor of mixed grain farming. The barn had a raised floor that allowed air circulation beneath the stored tobacco, and Isaiah discovered that this crawl space beneath the floor was accessible through a small entrance at the building's rear that was hidden by overgrown vegetation. Working primarily at night over a period of weeks, Isaiah excavated and expanded this space, creating a workshop approximately 8 feet by 10 feet with enough height to sit or crouch, but not to stand fully upright. He reinforced the floor above to prevent it from sagging or making sounds when people walked on the barn's main level, installed primitive ventilation that would allow smoke from a forge to disperse without being visible from outside, and created storage for tools and materials that would not be detectable through normal inspection of the barn. The workshop's location was brilliant for several reasons. The barn was far enough from the main house, and slave quarters that worked there at night would not be easily observed. But it was close enough to normal plantation operations that Isaiah's presence in the area would not be suspicious, since he was often asked to do metalwork for farm equipment. The crawl space entrance was concealed enough that casual observation would not reveal it, but it was accessible enough that Isaiah could enter and exit without leaving obvious tracks or disturbing vegetation in ways that would attract attention. And the barn's partial abandonment meant that overseers and other whites rarely entered it, reducing the chance of discovery. Isaiah accessed the workshop by claiming to work on repairs to farm equipment or on personal projects that his owner had authorized, activities that were normal for an enslaved blacksmith and that provided cover for his actual work constructing weapons. The risk was enormous because discovery would have resulted in severe punishment, including likely death, but Isaiah calculated that the risk was worth taking, given that the alternative was spending his entire life enslaved with no hope of freedom. The weapons Isaiah constructed in his hidden workshop were simple but effective, designed to be easy to make from available materials, and to serve the specific purpose of deterring pursuit rather than conducting offensive operations. Isaiah made approximately 40 bladed weapons of various types, including knives of different sizes that could be easily concealed and carried, machete-like tools that could serve as weapons while also being useful for clearing paths through wilderness, and several spear points that could be attached to wooden shafts to create reaching weapons. He made these items from scrap metal that he collected through various means, including taking damaged tools that were being discarded, salvaging metal from broken equipment, and occasionally stealing small amounts of raw material from the plantation's metalworking supplies in quantities small enough that the theft would not be noticed. Isaiah worked with primitive equipment, including a small portable forge that he constructed from clay and stones, bellows made from leather scraps, and tools that he had made himself from salvaged materials. The work was slow and required extraordinary attention to avoiding detection, but over approximately 4 months from February through May 1824, Isaiah successfully built an arsenal that would be sufficient to arm a substantial portion of his escape group. The recruitment and training phase of Isaiah's plan was even more delicate than the weapons construction, because it required bringing other people into the conspiracy, which multiplied the risks of discovery through informants or through careless talk. Isaiah began by identifying enslaved people who he knew well and who he believed could be absolutely trusted, primarily people who had been at Riverside Plantation for many years and who had experienced personal losses or trauma that made them desperate enough to take enormous risks for a chance at freedom. He approached them individually, testing their willingness to consider escape without initially revealing his actual plan, and only when he was confident of their commitment did he bring them fully into the conspiracy. The initial group included approximately 15 people, ranging in age from teenagers like Isaiah to adults in their 30s and 40s. These individuals became his core leadership team, who would help recruit others, and who would be responsible for managing different aspects of the escape once it happened. Isaiah trained this core group in basic self-defense and in coordinated movement, holding practice sessions disguised as normal activities like gathering firewood or working in fields far from the main house where they would not be closely observed. He taught them how to use the weapons he had constructed, not with the expectation that they would need to fight, but so that they would be comfortable enough with the weapons to display them convincingly if confronted by patrols. The expansion of recruitment beyond Riverside Plantation to include enslaved people from neighboring properties was perhaps the most dangerous phase of Isaiah's plan because it required coordination across plantations where people's movements were controlled and monitored. Isaiah used the system of plantation interconnections that existed in rural Virginia to make contact with enslaved people at other locations. His father, before being sold away several years earlier, had established relationships with blacksmiths and other skilled workers at multiple plantations through the hiring out system that allowed enslaved people with valuable skills to work temporarily at different locations. Isaiah maintained these relationships and used them to identify potential recruits at neighboring plantations. He made contact with these individuals through carefully arranged meetings that appeared coincidental, but that were actually planned, using market days, church gatherings, and other occasions when enslaved people from different plantations were in the same location. The recruitment message was simple. A large escape was being planned for late summer. Armed resistance would be possible if necessary, though the plan was to avoid violence, and anyone who wanted to join needed to be ready to leave everything behind and to follow orders without question during the escape. The response was extraordinary. Word spread through the networks of communication that enslaved people maintained despite constant surveillance, and by August 1824, Isaiah had recruited approximately 200 people from Riverside Plantation and from 6 neighboring plantations, all committed to the escape attempt and all waiting for Isaiah's signal about when and how it would happen. The logistical challenges of moving 200 people 300 miles through hostile territory were enormous, and Isaiah's solutions to these challenges demonstrated strategic thinking that would have been impressive in an experienced military commander, let alone in a 15-year-old enslaved boy. Isaiah obtained maps of Virginia and Pennsylvania by carefully copying information from maps he saw in the plantation owner's house where his mother had worked before being sold. He memorized routes and landmarks, identified rivers that could be forded, and areas of wilderness where a large group could move without being easily detected. He arranged for support from free black communities and from Quakers in Pennsylvania through contacts established via enslaved people whose family members had successfully escaped in previous years, and who maintained secret communication with people still enslaved. These northern supporters agreed to position themselves along the planned route to provide food, shelter, and information about patrols and dangers. Isaiah divided his group of 200 into smaller units of approximately 20 people each, with trusted leaders assigned to each unit who would be responsible for keeping their people together and for following the overall plan. He established communication methods, including simple signal systems that would allow the units to coordinate movement, even when separated by distance or terrain. And he planned the timing carefully, choosing late August for the escape, because the harvest season would mean maximum confusion, and because late summer weather would be more survivable than winter for people traveling long distances with limited supplies. The escape began on the night of August 22, 1824, chosen because it was a Saturday night when enslaved people had relatively more freedom of movement, and when the absence of people from their quarters would not be noticed until Sunday morning, when they would be expected for religious services. Isaiah had distributed weapons to approximately 40 trusted individuals who would serve as guards for the larger group, and he had provided basic supplies, including food that had been stockpiled secretly over many weeks. The coordination required to get 200 people from 7 different plantations to a predetermined meeting point was extraordinary, and it worked largely because Isaiah had planned it meticulously, and because the participants executed the plan with discipline despite enormous fear and stress. By dawn on August 23rd, the entire group of 200 had assembled in woods about 5 miles from Riverside Plantation, and they began moving north, following routes that Isaiah had mapped out during his preparations. The group moved primarily at night, hiding during the day in forests, swamps, and other areas where they would be difficult to detect. They avoided roads and towns where they might encounter patrols or where their large numbers would attract attention. And they maintained strict silence and discipline, with Isaiah's unit leaders enforcing the rule that any noise or deviation from the plan could endanger the entire group. The first week of the journey was the most dangerous, because it was during this period that the escape was discovered and that pursuit was organized. When enslaved people failed to appear for church services on Sunday, August 23rd, and when subsequent searches revealed that over 200 people from multiple plantations had vanished overnight, white authorities in Hanover County recognized immediately that this was not a typical escape of a few individuals, but was an organized mass movement. The response was swift and overwhelming. Armed patrols were mobilized, professional slave catchers were hired, and notices were sent to communities throughout Virginia, alerting them to watch for a large group of escaped enslaved people. The assumption was that such a large group, moving through countryside where every black face was scrutinized, would be easy to locate and apprehend, but Isaiah's planning confounded these expectations. His group moved faster than pursuers anticipated. They used terrain that made tracking difficult, and they benefited from assistance provided by free black people and by Quakers along their route, who misdirected patrols and who provided false information about the group's location and direction. The pursuing patrols came close to discovering the escapees several times during that first week, but each time Isaiah's discipline and his strategic positioning of armed guards allowed the group to avoid direct confrontation while continuing to move north toward Pennsylvania. The most dangerous moment of the entire escape came on the 8th day, when the group was crossing the Rappahannock River in northern Virginia. Isaiah had identified a ford where the river was relatively shallow and where crossing would be possible for the entire group, including children and elderly, individuals who were not strong swimmers. But he had not anticipated that heavy rains upriver would raise the water level, making the crossing significantly more dangerous than planned. The group reached the river after midnight, hoping to cross under cover of darkness, only to discover that the water was higher and faster than Isaiah's reconnaissance had indicated. Some members of the group wanted to wait for the water level to drop, but Isaiah recognized that patrols were close behind them and that waiting risked discovery. He decided to attempt the crossing despite the danger, organizing the group into lines where stronger individuals helped weaker ones, using rope that they had brought to create safety lines across the current, and positioning his armed guards to watch for patrols that might arrive while the group was vulnerable in the water. The crossing took over 2 hours, during which several people were swept downstream and had to be rescued, during which children cried and adults struggled not to panic, and during which the entire group was aware that they were exposed and vulnerable in ways they had not been since leaving their plantations. But Isaiah's organization held, and all 200 people made it across the Rappahannock without losing anyone and without being discovered by the patrols that were searching for them within a few miles of their location. The final 2 weeks of the journey were less acutely dangerous, but were marked by increasing physical exhaustion and by the psychological strain of maintaining discipline and hope over an extended period. The group was covering approximately 15 to 20 miles per night, moving through wilderness areas where navigation was difficult and where food and water were not always easily accessible. Isaiah's pre-positioning of supplies and support was critical during this phase. Free black families in Maryland provided food and shelter at predetermined stops. Quaker families in southern Pennsylvania offered resources and intelligence about patrol locations, and the network of support that Isaiah had established through careful planning before the escape made the difference between success and failure. Without this support, 200 people traveling without resources would have been forced to steal food or to reveal themselves in towns and settlements where their presence would have been reported to authorities. With the support, they were able to maintain their invisibility and their momentum, even as physical exhaustion became severe, and as some members of the group began to despair about whether they would actually reach Pennsylvania before being captured. The group crossed into Pennsylvania on September 12, 1824, exactly 3 weeks after they had escaped from their various plantations in Virginia. The crossing happened in early morning hours when they moved across the border in territory where no official checkpoints existed and where the change from Virginia to Pennsylvania was marked more by geography than by any visible political boundary. But the psychological impact of that crossing was profound for people who had lived their entire lives enslaved and who were now, for the first time, in a state where they could not be legally enslaved and where the laws offered them at least some measure of protection. Isaiah led his group to a Quaker community that had been prepared to receive them, and there, for the first time in 3 weeks, the group could rest without fear of imminent discovery and could begin to process what they had accomplished. 200 people who had been enslaved in Virginia were now free in Pennsylvania. Not a single person had been lost during the journey, despite crossing 300 miles of hostile territory while being actively pursued by armed men. And a 15-year-old boy had achieved what experienced resistance leaders with far more resources had failed to accomplish. The immediate aftermath of the escape saw Isaiah's group dispersing across Pennsylvania and beyond as individuals and families decided where to settle and how to build their new lives. Some remained in the Quaker communities that had supported their escape, finding work and establishing homes in small towns where abolitionist sentiment was strong. Others traveled further north to New York, or even to Canada, where they would be beyond the reach of slave catchers who sometimes operated in Pennsylvania despite its free status. Still others headed to Philadelphia, where a significant free black community existed and where they could find support and opportunities. Isaiah himself settled initially in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, continuing to work as a blacksmith and helping to establish systems for supporting other escaped enslaved people who reached Pennsylvania. But he did not stop with his own escape and the freeing of the 200 who had followed him. Over the next decade, Isaiah became one of the most effective conductors on the Underground Railroad, helping to organize escapes for hundreds more enslaved people and developing techniques and networks that would be used by other freedom seekers and their allies throughout the remaining years before the Civil War ended slavery. The response in Virginia to the escape was a mixture of rage, embarrassment, and fear. The loss of over 200 enslaved people in a single coordinated escape represented an enormous financial blow to the plantation owners who had lost their human property, with the total value of the escaped people estimated at over $100,000 in $1,824. But the financial loss was less concerning to Virginia authorities than the example that Isaiah's success had set and the fear that it would inspire similar attempts. If a 15-year-old boy could organize and execute such a successful escape, what might more experienced and resourced leaders be able to accomplish? The response was to suppress information about the escape, refusing to acknowledge its scale or success publicly, destroying or sealing official records, and imposing severe penalties on anyone who discussed the incident in ways that might glorify Isaiah or inspire imitation. Newspapers were prevented from reporting accurate details, with official statements claiming that only a few enslaved people had escaped and that they would soon be recaptured. The construction of the weapons workshop, which was eventually discovered, was particularly concerning because it demonstrated capabilities and planning that white Virginians believed enslaved people were incapable of, challenging racist assumptions about black intelligence and organizational ability. The official response to the discovery was to claim that the weapons had been provided by Northern abolitionists rather than constructed by Isaiah himself, because acknowledging that an enslaved teenager had secretly built an arsenal beneath his owner's nose was too threatening to white supremacist ideology to admit publicly. The historical documentation of Isaiah's escape was suppressed for nearly a century, preserved primarily through oral traditions in the families of the people he freed and through fragmented references in letters and diaries of Quakers and abolitionists who had assisted the escape. Plantation records from the Virginia counties affected by the escape typically showed individuals as having been sold or having run away individually, rather than as having participated in a mass exodus, deliberately obscuring the coordinated nature of the event. Virginia government records that might have documented the official response were apparently destroyed or sealed, making it difficult for later historians to reconstruct what had happened. The recovery of the full story began in the 1920s when historians studying the Underground Railroad began finding references to a massive 1824 escape organized by a teenage blacksmith named Isaiah. And over subsequent decades, scholars pieced together the evidence from multiple sources, including interviews with descendants of the freedom seekers, Quaker archives, and fragmentary plantation records that had survived. By the 1960s, enough evidence had been accumulated to establish the basic facts of Isaiah's achievement and to recognize it as one of the most significant acts of resistance in American slavery history. Though many details remained uncertain or disputed due to the deliberate suppression of evidence at the time, the question of whether Isaiah's methods could have been replicated on a larger scale and whether mass escapes might have been a viable path toward ending slavery earlier than the Civil War accomplished has been debated by historians examining his case. Isaiah succeeded partly through his own extraordinary abilities. His intelligence, his technical skills, his leadership, and his strategic thinking were all exceptional and could not be assumed in most other potential escape organizers. But he also succeeded through careful planning, through building support networks before attempting the escape, through disciplined execution that avoided unnecessary violence, and through techniques that other people could potentially learn and apply. The fact that Virginia authorities suppressed information about the escape suggests they recognized that Isaiah's methods were indeed potentially replicable and that they feared mass escapes becoming common if enslaved people understood that such escapes were possible. Whether more frequent large-scale escapes would have ended slavery earlier is impossible to know, but the suppression of Isaiah's story certainly ensured that his example could not inspire the resistance that white authorities feared. The legacy of Isaiah's escape extended beyond the immediate freedom of 200 individuals to influence the broader development of resistance to slavery and the operation of the Underground Railroad. Many of the people Isaiah freed became active in helping others escape, using techniques they had learned during their own journey and leveraging the networks that Isaiah had established. Isaiah himself continued his work as a conductor for over a decade, and the routes and methods he developed were shared with other conductors throughout the Underground Railroad network. His emphasis on careful planning, on building support systems before attempting escapes, on arming people for deterrent purposes while avoiding violence when possible, and on moving large groups rather than just individuals, influenced how many subsequent escapes were organized. The story of what a 15-year-old had accomplished also served as inspiration for enslaved people who heard about it through the oral tradition that preserved the story even when official records suppressed it, demonstrating that resistance was possible and that intelligence and planning could defeat even powerful opponents who controlled resources and legal systems. Isaiah lived until 1867, dying in Pennsylvania at age 58, having lived the last 43 years of his life as a free man in the community he helped build after leading 200 people out of slavery. He married, raised children who were born free and who never experienced the horrors of slavery that their father had endured. He worked as a blacksmith and as a builder, using the same skills that had allowed him to construct weapons in secret to build homes and tools for his free community. He never returned to Virginia, and apparently never attempted to contact anyone who remained enslaved there, perhaps because it was too dangerous, or perhaps because the trauma of his early years made him unwilling to revisit that part of his life. He did not write his own account of the escape, and if he spoke about it to his children, they did not pass down detailed stories of how it was accomplished, leaving historians to reconstruct the events from fragmentary external evidence. But his achievement stands as one of the most extraordinary acts of resistance in American history, accomplished by a teenage boy who refused to accept enslavement and who possessed the intelligence and courage to not just free himself, but to free 200 others and to reach Pennsylvania without losing a single person. What should we learn from Isaiah's story? First, that enslaved people were not passive victims, waiting for others to free them, but were active agents who took whatever actions were possible to resist their oppression, and that some of them accomplished feats that were extraordinary by any measure. Second, that youth should not be mistaken for incapability, and that extraordinary achievements can come from people society dismisses as too young, too uneducated, or too oppressed to accomplish anything significant. Third, that intelligence, planning, and discipline can overcome overwhelming advantages in resources and power, and that David can defeat Goliath when David is smart enough to use the right weapons and tactics. Fourth, that the suppression of historical evidence is itself a political act designed to prevent people from learning lessons and drawing inspiration from events that powerful interests want forgotten, and that recovering suppressed history is essential for understanding both past and present. And finally, that the legacy of resistance includes not just the immediate victories achieved, but the inspiration and techniques passed down to others who continue the struggle. Remember Isaiah. Remember the 15-year-old enslaved boy who built weapons secretly in a crawl space beneath a tobacco barn, who trained 200 people in self-defense and coordinated movement, who organized the largest successful mass escape in Virginia history, who led his people 300 miles through hostile territory while being pursued by armed patrols, and who reached Pennsylvania without losing a single person. Remember that authorities suppressed his story for nearly a century because they feared what it revealed about enslaved people's capabilities and about the vulnerability of the slavery system. Remember that what Isaiah accomplished at 15 years old was judged impossible by people who had far more experience and resources, but who lacked his combination of intelligence, courage, and determination. And remember that the 200 people he freed went on to help hundreds more escape and to build communities where their children and grandchildren would be born free. Isaiah's achievement deserves to be as well known as any act of resistance in American history, and the fact that it was suppressed for so long is itself evidence of how threatening his example was to those who benefited from slavery. What do you think about Isaiah's accomplishment and about the suppression of his story for nearly a century? Could his methods have been replicated on a larger scale? And might mass escapes have ended slavery earlier if Isaiah's example had been widely known? What responsibility do we have today to recover and honor the stories of enslaved people who resisted in ways that were deliberately erased from official history? And what lessons from Isaiah's strategic thinking and leadership at age 15 remain relevant today for people facing oppression and seeking liberation? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of the teenage boy who freed 200 people challenged your understanding of enslaved people's resistance and demonstrated the importance of recovering suppressed history, hit that subscribe button for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We are committed to uncovering the stories that powerful interests tried to bury, to honoring the people whose extraordinary achievements were deliberately erased from historical memory, and to ensuring that resistance to oppression is remembered and celebrated. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that enslaved people were not passive victims, but were brilliant strategists and courageous fighters who accomplished extraordinary things despite facing overwhelming opposition. Isaiah was 15 years old when he freed 200 people. Remember him. Remember what he accomplished. And remember that his story was suppressed because it was too dangerous, too inspiring, too powerful to be allowed to spread. Now you know the truth. Share it.